so we're going to be discussing the language that we employ around rape in Africa. And of course, we'll branch out a bit from there, but only a bit since we don't have that much time.
Shall I go last time? Okay, all right. Well, some of you may have heard me this morning. My name is Jude Kelly. I'm the Artistic Director of the South Bank Centre. And 8 years ago, I started a festival called WOW, Women of the World. And some of those sessions are here today with my colleague Hannah Poole. I started the festival because I felt sad that as a woman who'd managed to get to a very significant place from really quite lowly background, I was in a situation where I was watching so many women silencing themselves about so many things. Now, I can only speak about my experience of being British and what rape is like in Britain and all the conversations I've then had around the world with women because of the festival. And if I had to say we had one thing in common, it would be violence against women. And the idea that somehow this violence against women, and particularly sexual violence, is the woman's shame. I mean, it seems to me that rape, and my guess is that in this room, statistically, many of us would say, yes, we have been sexually violated or raped. And I would say, if I trigger anything, I apologise, but it's so amazing how many women bury the subject and how many communities insist on burying the subject and how everybody colludes to make a woman feel that she must silence one of the most traumatic things that have happened to her. And I began to create these rape testimony sessions in WOW, where I basically said, if you have had a violation and you feel able to move from feeling as if you have to be silent to something where you could speak out, you would make it possible for so many more women to then speak out, girls and women. And I started these sessions and we got more and more women who said, I'm terrified, I've never spoken about it in public, but I'm going to try. And out of those testimonies came groups of women who then started touring schools, talking to children and young people and having online conversations. And I think we can reach a tipping point where women say, actually, it isn't our shame and it isn't our blame, and we're going to talk about it together. But it has to be a kind of movement to reach a critical mass where everybody says, okay, we're in this together.
My name is Pumla Gqola. I'm an African feminist author and professor of African literature at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. How do I come to this topic? Well, I'm a feminist in the world, I'm a woman in the world. I wrote a book called Rape, a South African Nightmare, which came out in 2015. And I did so because for a variety of reasons, because in South Africa we spend a lot of time talking about rape. But I think that there are various things that are very wrong, very limiting about how we talk about rape. And so I was interested in trying to figure out, first of all, why the rape crisis, which in some respects is global, but I was looking at the kind of global linkages, but I was also looking at what it is about specific rape culture in South Africa historically and in the contemporary moment that enables a country to both obsessively talk about rape in its popular, in its public, in its official discourse, but not seem to make any inroads. So I was looking at the kind of historical, how we got here, and so on. And of course I'd been working, I think as many of us in the world, committed to making some kind of contribution to creating a rape-free future, which I think we have to create. And so that's my most recent entry into it. But of course, I'd worked in my 20s I'd worked in rape crisis centers, had been a rape crisis counselor, and had done various other work with feminists both in South Africa and different parts of the continent and the world in different feminist work, but also specifically in anti-gender-based violence, violence against women work.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laure Beaufils. I'm the UK Deputy High Commissioner here in Nigeria, based in Lagos. The reason I'm on this panel is that I care hugely about women's rights, and my story started when I was relatively young, working in Cambodia at the time, working on violence against women and working on sex work. And I befriended a lot of sex workers at the time and learned about what it is like to suffer rape or to have to sell your body for an income. And on the back of that, I did a master's in gender and development and resolved to put the issue of women's rights at the heart of everything that I do, which is what I'm now trying to do in my diplomatic career here in Nigeria. Having arrived in Nigeria about 9 months, what struck me was that there were incredibly formidable women with such strong voices that are sassy, no nonsense, and that will just not suffer fools, but equally a critical mass of women who are voiceless and quite a prominent patriarchy. My take, or the lens I take on rape, is that it's fundamentally about whether you value women and girls, and it's fundamentally about power and exploitation of vulnerability. So it's always, if a girl or woman is raped, it's fundamentally because a man who has power has decided that he will use that power against a vulnerable woman or girl. It's something I think we need to speak about a lot more. It's pervasive, and this is why I wanted to be here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Oluwaseun Ayodeji Osowobi, and I run a foundation called Stand to End Rape Initiative. Why did I start the organization, and why am I here today? Around 2013, I would read stories online about girls who had been defiled, and I would see the narrative they used to express these young girls had been defiled. And I would see maybe Chiamaka was raped, but I never got to see the name of the rapist. And I also never got information about what had happened to the lady. Did she get any medical help? Was there any legal help? Was there any help at all that was available to her? So I kept reading the stories, but it didn't really hit me because I didn't understand what the Chiamaka lady might have gone through. So in 2011, I experienced sexual violence. And that's where everything changed for me, because at the time, there were no support services available for me in the state I was as a core member. And so I thought to myself, this is a major issue. If I read about it on a daily basis, and I have also experienced it, and there is no form of support for me or for the ladies I've read about, what exactly am I going to do about it? So in 2014, the organization started basically to provide support services to everyone who has experienced, not everyone, because that's exaggerating, but for those who I get to know, or that my team members and I get to know, that have experienced any form of sexual violence at all. And what do? We provide medical, legal, and psychosocial support. And why I'm here today is because I believe that everyone here, myself inclusive, we have so much work to do on changing how rape is presented, or how we even understand the concept, or what we do about it, what we say about it. I also am interested in seeing what each and everyone as a community can actually do individually to address the issues of sexual violence within their confines. Because sometimes we hear about sexual violence in a very, very close space, but we ignore it because, after all, it's not really me it happened to. It's somebody else, so I can't really understand their pain. So I'm just here to learn and also to share the little experience I have gained from working with survivors of sexual violence.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I want to address this first question to you, Pumla. You mentioned the fact that rape is discussed very publicly and almost obsessively in South Africa, and I think we have a similar thing here where there are very public conversations. There are lots of people who are vocal about being against sexual violence, and yet rape continues to happen because it seems as if we make rapists safe in our societies. So I would like us, starting with you, to share some of your ideas about what it is in the way we talk about rape that makes people feel safe enough to continue raping.
Thank you. I think that several things happen. I mean, I think that, first of all, this appearance of, well, the fact that we're talking about rape so much makes it seem as though we care about rape as much as we talk about it, right? And so, in many ways, the talking about it becomes an excuse for doing some of the work that we need to do in order to end a rape culture. What do I mean? So in South Africa, for example, and I think in Nigeria and in various other places, we speak about rape as a moment. So we're shocked around, so when there's a prominent rape, then everybody's shocked and nobody quite understands, and we pay attention to that particular incidence of rape, right? But the focus, of course, is on the survivor or the victim. And that person becomes hyper visible, and there may be hundreds of rapes happening in that year, but we treat each one as a separate thing, and we refuse to see the patterns, or we refuse to pay attention to the patterns, right? So each one is a moment, and it's shock and horror. And then there's the concept of rape that we all oppose to. But we don't ask questions about, or we don't ask enough questions about, well, how is it that we're all shocked and horrified, and yet it happens all the time? What else are we doing to enable it? Why don't we know? Why do we know so much about the victims, the survivors, and so little about who the perpetrators are, right? And so we act as though they are Martians that fly in, rape, get back on their spaceship, and we have inferior technology on Earth, and they go off, and so there's all this evidence of rape, but there's no, and so I think that's part of it. But also, of course, we forget that rape does not, I think rape is a very important part of how patriarchy works. And so we have to think about what enables it. But we don't want to do that work. So everybody wants to be opposed in principle or theoretically to rape, but not to sexual violence more broadly, not to a violent gender power more broadly. And so, of course, we cannot end rape without addressing, while paying no attention to what it is for.
So you raised so many great points. And Ayodeji and I this morning were talking about the function of rape that you just alluded to within patriarchy, and how obscuring that function allows rape to continue. So if you could just speak to that a bit and share.
So this morning we're having a conversation about how rape is depicted even in articles, on newspapers, and in the social media space. For example, you see things like 20 women were raped in 2 months in a particular location, but you don't see anything about who were the rapists. Even the concept of, with all due respect, the concept of violence against women, it's a fantastic thing, but then there is no active person in that word. So what we're basically doing is violence against women, but who are the people perpetrating the violence against women? They are absolved of that responsibility, so they don't feel like it is my fight, or is it something I need to be a part of to end? It is violence against women, so women also need to address the issue that happened to them. It doesn't concern us men. And I also spoke to her about the issue of women's bodily autonomy. We are at a place where a woman is viewed as a property, and the value of our property is in our sexual purity. And so as such, when a girl is raped, you don't think about the girl that has been raped as the victim or as a singular entity that has been violated. You begin to think about how the man she's going to marry is going to feel about her being a victim of sexual violence. So you forget her existence as a person, but you begin to pay attention to the man that is going to marry her. And for me, that's really problematic. If we continue to think about the people who mostly perpetrate the violence and forget about the survivors themselves, that's a major issue. And that's why you have issues of violence against female sex workers, for example, because they are a property that you feel are already damaged, or you feel already do these things already, they're already having sex. So really, I don't really need to get a consent to actually violate her, to have sex with her. I can violate her at will. Because then again, our property, our value as a property has been defiled, because by herself, she's made a decision on what she wants to do. But then you feel that as a person, our value is gone. Who made you the judge of value?
Thank you. So now to flip the script a bit from how we make our societies safe for rapists to talk about what it is that makes women or survivors feel safe enough to come forward and talk about their rapes, and whether it is enough for us to ask women to come forward, or if there's more that we need to do to support them and then make bigger spaces safer for people to come forward.
Well, in the testimony sessions that I hold, they're not women only. By consent, they're mixed, as this audience is today. Because I think in total agreement with what everybody has said, that legally we are no longer property in the UK, but it's only quite recent. And but psychologically we are still property. And so when women have some levels of sexual liberation in terms of, being able to have a sexual appetite and being able to have the right to choose whether they want to have children or not, it's almost like all these women are available as property, and you can pick which property you want. Now, that's not something that society discusses and says, but it's psychologically underneath everything. And I believe that two things have to happen. We have to ask men, and I am asking the men in this room too, to begin the conversations about male responsibility. Because in the end, we are asking women to support ourselves through very difficult situations, and rape isn't like an occasion, it's a lifetime. You're asking women to support themselves through that whole situation, both individually and in a community. And in my experience, most men say, well, it's kind of nothing to do with me because I didn't do it. But first of all, how are there so many women being raped and we can't find a man who's done it? I mean, either there's one man and he's just so busy, or a lot of men are raping and they're not acknowledging that they're raping. Now, I mean, this is a key thing, because I think that, we have an idea that rape always is extremely violent. I mean, physically jumping out of strangers behind bushes with a knife. Sometimes, of course, it is, terribly. But very often it isn't. Very often it's a coercive moment by a partner, a friend, a fellow student, all kinds of people. And I think, knowing, men as I do, I've got one that I live with, and I've got a son, and I've got a dad. I think men think, well, if it got as far as that, it must have been okay. Because they can't think that they are rapists, because they have an image of a rapist just like we do. So I think that for women to feel safe about talking about all of this, I think men have got to acknowledge that they want to be in the conversation too, to listen, to learn, and to pick up language that they will start using amongst each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Laure, I'm going to ask you a question about value. You said something earlier that in the end, ending rape is about teaching people to value women and girls. Or rape is about people not valuing women and girls. So I want to ask you a question about how women's value is debated in society. Ayodeji mentioned reading stories about defilement. And words like defilement, I think, imply that there has been something lost, something taken away from the person. So if a child is raped and we call it defilement, what we're saying is that her purity is diminished, and so her value is diminished. What are the ways that you think people can reframe valuing women such that what happens to our bodies, or specifically our vaginas, doesn't diminish our value?
Thank you. I think part of that answer has to be about education, and in particular the education of boys. So we were just talking about the role of men. It's a shame we don't have any men on the panel, but I completely agree with what's been said. You know, and the theme of this panel is about language as well. Well, language is not just a language of rape narrowly defined. It's also when we tell boys, you know, oh, boys will be boys, or that kind of expression which is so pervasive in society would suggest it's okay to be a bit rough, you know, it's okay to be a little bit violent, because it's quite endearing because you're a boy. And so boys are brought up to believe that that's acceptable. Girls are brought up to believe that their value is in purity, and that their role is, you know, to do the dishes when their brothers don't. So I think we all have a role in challenging stereotypes, in calling out sexism when we hear it, and in educating our boys and our girls, which is fundamental, I think, to change the understanding. But, you know, patriarchy is hundreds of years old, and it's going to be a very long journey, I think, and sometimes it's 2 steps forwards and 1 step backwards, and sometimes it's 1 step forwards and 2 steps backwards. And I think we've got to recognize that fundamentally women have got to be in the room or at the table whenever decisions are made on our bodies, on sexual health, on reproductive health policies and the like, because unless we are, the fundamentals are not going to change either.
Thank you. So Pumla, I'm going to bring this back to you and your reference to the manufacture of female fear and how that ties into using sexual violence to regulate women's behavior. So I'm going to ask you this question directly, and I want the other panelists to contribute when you're done, to think about how women are told to behave to prevent rape, but also how we frame that women have made themselves rapeable by whatever actions that they take. So how is rapeability constructed in public consciousness, and how do we use female fear to sort of control that?
So in this book, in my one of my books, Rapist of African Nightmare, I talk about this thing, the female fear factory, or the manufacture of female fear, and I argue that rape is both the thing that women are most feared, are most reared to fear. So it's the product of the fear factory, but it's also, so it has this strange role that seems counterintuitive, right? So it's both the thing that you are threatened with, but it is also part of what rape does is to also create the female fear factory. And the female fear factory is about teaching women that our bodies don't belong to us, that public spaces don't belong to us. It's part of how patriarchy teaches us to self-censor and to monitor and to make ourselves smaller and to not resist in very specific ways. So I tell this story in one of the chapters, which I'm going to try to tell very quickly, about a woman, and this is kind of just an example of something that I think many of us who live in the world will recognize aspects of. Lemupule, who's a feminist activist and writer, walks into this shop in the middle of Johannesburg, CBD Johannesburg. There's a young woman the shop has various people. It's a small shop, but it has lots of people in it. She sees a young woman who's clearly getting unwanted attention from a young man. He tries to talk to her. She does all the things we raise globally our girls to do. She tries to communicate that she doesn't want to talk to him. She does various things. She looks away. She moves her body. She moves to a different part of the shop. He is unrelenting, because we also teach our boys that good girls are worth pursuing. That when women say no, they don't mean no. We say it's romantic to be rapey. to pursue and to court and all of these things. And then we say, what do you mean you were rapey? So he continues to follow her around. She moves. There are several other people in the shop. They look at her. They look at him. They do what they're doing. They mind their own business. Eventually, the young woman, after about 15 minutes of this, says, leave me alone. He turns around and he says, you see, this is why we rape you. And everybody looks away, and crazy feminist Lebopule walks up to this man in a fit of rage and yells at him and says, what do you mean this is why we rape you? How is this why we rape you? How many people have you raped? And just kind of goes on at him. And this young man is shocked and flees. And when he flees, everybody else in the shop says, don't worry so much, don't worry yourself so much. Even the young woman who was being pursued is a bit taken aback. She's grateful, but she says, oh, don't worry. She now offers sympathy to the person who interrupts. And I like the story because I think it's a very quick way of illustrating various things that are very familiar, right? That this business of minding your own business, this entrenched notion also about not taking women's no's seriously, that is a global culture of romance, which also, of course, plays into this high, ridiculously dangerous notion of rape as sex, right? We know rape is not sex, of course. Rape is not, if I stab someone, nobody thinks that has anything to do with butchery, right? The knife is incidental to the violence. And yet, in rape, we often pretend that it is about sex. And in a culture where we're pretending that women's sex is for somebody else, and women, sex is not for them and their bodies do not belong to them, it makes sense that we and of course, there are no consequences, right? We also live in context, I live in a country where the highest office of the land is occupied by someone who was accused of rape, right? Where there are no real consequences. And I believe Kwezi. I believed her when she was alive, and I believe her today. And Kwezi was the complainant in the Jacob Zuma rape trial. So there are no real consequences. And so, and that's part of manufacturing the fear factory, right? So even if we say break the silence, but what happens when you break the silence? What happens when someone grabs you in the street? There are no consequences. So we have this unreasonable expectation that women will act differently and are responsible exclusively for ending rape and for both managing themselves so that they're unrapeable, which is impossible, and are compliant to the ways in which we're terrorized by various patriarchal ways in which we're taught that we don't belong to ourselves, and certainly public space does not belong to us.
Does anyone else want to add?
I just wanted to talk about two different things. And the first one being a number of girls, when growing up, were taught that our sexuality is not for us. We're taught that we cannot demand for sex. As a girl, the sex is not for you. It's to be done on you by the man. But what is very problematic then again is you teach us that we should not request for sex, but then you also teach us to be scared of the persons who are meant to have sex with us because it can be violent, and most times it will be violent. It means there is a problem with us as a society because we're going forward and we're also going backward. You're telling girls this, but you're allowing boys to do that, and it's okay to do that.
There's an interesting campaign happening at the moment, which is, you probably know because of Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, in the UK and across Hollywood and so on. And so there's this campaign saying Me Too. And the positive thing about that is women going beyond the idea that they have to hold on to this personal shame and saying, actually, yes, I could tell you I was mugged 3 times, but I'm actually going to tell you that I was raped 3 times, or I'm actually going to tell you I was sexually violated 5 times. So they're trying to put Me Too into the same category as saying, other crimes happened to me, which I don't have to be ashamed of. And I think that is a very positive next step. I think that we, as a community of women, have got to go Me Too, even though it's painful. And because I think as well, if we do that, an awful lot of women will suddenly track back and go, actually, that does include me, doesn't it? Because I think even women have been taught to make this massive distinction between violent rape and every other kind of sexual violation, and put the other kind in a sort of, well, that's just the way it is. But why should it be what it is? It's that sort of general humiliation and degradation. So I think changing that language to Me Too together is a very important thing. And I think that we have to ask our mothers and our grandmothers to kind of come with us, even though they're going to find that hard because of this notion of purity. But the other thing I wanted to say is about identification with the act of rape. I have found that when men think about being raped, if they think about being penetrated as a man, unwillingly, they are horrified at that idea. They physically are repulsed by the idea of being invaded, physically penetrated. But when I asked men about that, they say, yes, but that's because we're not used to it. So but this isn't, I mean, just because we're shocked doesn't mean to say we should let that go. I mean, I think a lot of boys and men would think, well, if it has been pleasant to be penetrated, why is it so unpleasant the next time if you didn't really want it? I think, honestly, there is a really difficult issue of psychological understanding by many men, empathy, if you like. And so they think that male rape is really terrible, whereas female rape is sort of like sex, but just not as nice. And I'm talking about, the kind of something like the non-violent intrusion that a lot of women experience. And so, I think your point, it is education, emotional education, not just sort of things that you oughtn't to do.
Sorry. I feel like we cannot end a conversation about rape without talking about what consent is. You've alluded to so much. We have 10 minutes, so my brain is like, but people are so resistant to the idea that rape is not just a person forcefully inserting a penis into a vagina and leaving bruises. People are so resistant to that idea, and I think part of it might be because then so many more people become what they imagine to be rapists, which is like, well, rapists are this other thing, and what I did with this person who was my girlfriend or who was my friend is something else entirely. So how do we start to expand the notion of what consent is? How do we start to really reinforce the idea that women have sexual agency? Women must be active participants in sexual contact, otherwise that is rape. And how do we get the people who are most likely to rape, aka men, to internalize this idea in meaningful ways? And is that even our job, or should men be doing this?
Okay, sorry I lost my thoughts. I was getting a bit emotional. I apologize about that. So about the issue of consent, there's so many variations to this. There is the attitudinal consent and the mental consent. And the mental consent is the one where men assume that mentally, if I'm dressed a certain way or if I'm at a certain place, it means I am ready for sex at any time. So for example, if I am at a man's house late night, he believes mentally I've consented to it. But there is a place for attitudinal and verbal consent where a person has to say yes. Not a coerced yes, not a threatened yes or intimidated yes. It has to be a yes where both parties understand what is about to happen and both parties align with the process. So how do we get men to start understanding what consent is? They need to open their minds and open their heads and listen to us. You need to listen. It's not about your ego. It's not about your penis. It's about how a woman feels at that time. There is nothing like, oh, I will die. You will not die. As a matter of fact, I've never heard of a man who stopped having sex and died immediately. It does not make any sense. But we need to get into our young men and even older ones, because we have, there's something about mentally grooming someone to give consent. They mentally groom ladies. And sometimes you begin to even see like it was not his fault. I gave consent, but you didn't. You were mentally groomed to it. And men are very good with that. And you need to correct that perspective that you have, because we know now, we're aware about it, and we're no longer taking it at all. So I'm not here to tell any man what to do. I'm here to tell you to listen. If she says no, and no is no, it does not mean yes, she's not confused. If she's drunk, she cannot give consent. If she's at your house at late night, go and sleep. Leave her alone. You need to listen.
So I completely agree with what Olu said. No means no. I mean, it's pretty easy. But also sometimes yes means no. And that's complicated because there are other forms of power that are not just in terms of physical power that men can exude on women. So we've seen again in the UK that there were groups of men grooming young girls and taking advantage. And it was psychological grooming before physical violence. So it's a complicated notion. But I think what we're seeing is that, you know, we've been talking about consent for decades and it's not really working. And one of the reasons that is, it's not because it's the wrong notion, but it's again the onus on and the emphasis on women, right? And what they said. What about men? What about them having to demonstrate whether, you know, in front of vulnerable women, how they acted? You know, could we turn it on its head a little bit? I think it's really quite important to, again, think about rape as exploitation. Did they take advantage of a particular vulnerability? I'd like to come back to a previous point. Earlier this week I was at a conference and we were talking about sexual harassment, and I was sitting next to a very senior and powerful lady, and she says, the other thing we need to think about is the way women dress here in Nigeria, right? And I must have looked quite baffled and quite shocked at that. And she said, no, but you know, it's not the same in the UK, but it's a very serious issue here. And so I was quite gobsmacked that I was hearing this in a conference that was about women's rights as well. And I think what I'm trying to say is two things. First of all, we've got to put to bed the notion that men are predators and that they can't control their sexual urges, right? So there's that stereotype which has got to be challenged, and we've got to think about what it is like to be a man, but clearly that is not part of a man's DNA, so we really need to challenge that myth. I'd like to think also about the role of women, right? So we've only just got to Me Too, to listening to women, to actually believing them, right? So these women, the Harvey Weinstein women, they've been abused for decades, and they've chosen not to speak up because they thought they wouldn't be listened to, or because they thought they wouldn't then not have any career. They didn't want to be seen as victims. You know, that means that every single person here would know something very intimate about me and would only ever see me, or not only ever, but you know, would see me in a way that's very personal. But all of this is also because society, including women, have not believed women. And I think we as women can also step up in the way that we engage, in the way that we work together, and in the way we take to the streets, in the way that we demand our rights, we demand respect. And I think this, you know, we have to work hand in hand with men, but we can also do better. And fundamentally, we're not always our best friends. There's this myth that we also should put to bed, that, you know, women backstab each other or bitchy with each other, whereas of course we can and should be something else. We should be about sisterhood and supporting each other and believing each other and putting ourselves first. We should be voting for women, coaching women, encouraging women. And if we did more of that, I think that would also be important.
Okay, so unfortunately we're out of time. I'm just going to close by saying that I know if I were to ask how many people in this room have experienced sexual violence, I would get a significant show of hands. Whereas if I were to ask how many people in this room have committed sexual violence, it would be dead silent. So what I want us to take away from this conversation, besides these incredible insights that these women have shared with us today, is introspection. Go back and look at yourself and ask yourself, what are the ways in which I use the power that I have not earned as a man to exploit women's vulnerability?